Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about learning a language by osmosis. In particular, we're going to talk about whether an adult can move to another country and quickly learn a language just by showing up. So, what inspired this question? When I was moving to Barcelona, Spain, I met the person who would be taking my share house room. It was a friend of a friend. I asked her whether she was also learning Spanish in anticipation of moving there, and she confidently remarked, "Oh, I'll just learn it when I'm there." And I thought, "Oh, interesting." It sounded like the words of a polyglot, or perhaps the words of someone who was a bit naive when it came to language learning. Or maybe they just were parroting something that they'd heard from elsewhere, or parroting something that they thought was possible. I must say I was quite surprised by her response, so I thought I might give an idea of how I think that might go for somebody if they were to turn up and learn the language on the spot. But first, what is learning by osmosis? Osmosis is a biological term which describes the way in which water moves through cells in some organisms. Put even more simply, learning by osmosis means learning by exposure. In the context of language learning, this effect could be created by various types of schooling, by moving to another country, or could be a staycation where you go to various events or venues that will help you to be exposed to the language that you want to learn. You can passively learn through osmosis in various ways, such as by reading books, watching films, hanging out with native speakers of the language but in your home city, and even changing the language in your phone, so you're learning those little words and phrases that you might not by looking at a textbook. So now that we know what learning a language by osmosis can involve, let's get back to our main question. Can we learn by osmosis easily? If you're under the age of 6 and you're watching this, well, you're in luck, because you can learn a language quite easily just through exposure. In fact, the golden age or the golden period of language learning is up for debate. But up to the age of 6 is often a threshold that people talk about, but there are others that would say up to the age of 18. In other words, up to the start of adulthood. But can an adult learn a language by osmosis with ease? The first question here is, what context would that be in? Perhaps through an intensive course of 20 hours a week. Some people might do this if they're working for the military, or if they're moving to another country through their own business, who has perhaps paid for this type of course to get them integrated very quickly. But for many people, that type of thing is beyond their reach for financial reasons, among others. Another context is that you personally have decided to move to a country for work or for leisure or for love. And lastly, what some others might be exposed to is the opportunity to move to another country for a semester at university, perhaps because it's part of their degree of a language they're learning, or simply that they're interested in studying in another country. So let's start with the optimistic answer, which is yes. If you've laid some of the groundwork by learning the grammar or some of the basics of the language, then yeah, you can probably quite easily add to this by learning words and phrases on the go in the country that you've moved to, or in your other context of learning by osmosis. While you might learn some vocabulary and basic phrases through osmosis, you're probably not going to learn the conditional from your friends while you're in the cafe, or the subjunctive while you're bopping in the club, or indeed the various different past tenses and their meanings when you're at the beach. That is, unless you expressly ask them to, unless they really know what they're talking about, or if you give them something in exchange. Immersing yourself in the language you want to learn by moving to a country where it is spoken could help you immensely. You'll learn basic words and phrases for food and drink simply by going to restaurants with friends, or by doing your weekly supermarket shop. You'll keep hearing things on the street and learn the word or phrase simply by observing the context that the speaker was in. You'll learn phrases by bumping into people and hearing what they say. Que susto, somebody in Spain might say when they're shocked or afraid. Or que asco when they see human poo on the street. Yep, that actually happened in Barcelona. There'll be many things you'll learn just by being there, and it'll all be just such a joy. But wait, how will you pick that up if you haven't learned any of the language before you go there? And now for the more sobering answer, which is no. If you haven't laid the groundwork or learned the basics of the language, you probably won't learn that much by osmosis, even if you're in the country where the language is spoken. You'll probably just be overwhelmed. And there are a couple of social factors that play into this. If you turn up without learning the basics of a language, I envision that the following could happen. You won't necessarily get the exposure to the language you're looking for because you don't yet have the capacity to make local friends who speak the language and will be willing to endure your early learning stages and low level. Without local friends, many of your interactions may simply be in the cafes or supermarkets or when you're doing administrative stuff. And because of the language barrier, you may have some interactions that don't inspire you to keep going, or they may overwhelm you. Or worse still, you might develop a bit of ill will towards the locals or even the city you've chosen. You won't have the time or the money to take classes because you'll be looking for jobs, you'll be trying to make new friends, and you'll be dealing with the bureaucracy that it takes to move to a new country or city. You'll say to yourself, that sounds boring. I've moved to a new city. I want to see the sights. I want to meet new people. I want to do all of the things. I don't want to sit in a classroom. Because you can't yet speak the language, you'll meet other people who also don't speak the language. And suddenly, you're living an expat life. And over time, even if you learn the language, you probably won't have the time, energy, or inclination to now meet locals because you've already got a set of friends. From experience, the language you start speaking in with someone is the language you'll continue your friendship through. Even if you learn the language in the meantime, which will probably take you years, you're not going to suddenly switch to that language as the main form of communication with that friend. If you move to a new country with a different language that you haven't yet learned, you will very likely do a job that you can do in your native language, which will further entrench your lack of opportunities for learning the local language. To add to all of this, if you're a native speaker of English, you may get some comments from people going, oh, yet another English speaker who's come to the country and hasn't learned the language. And this could cause a bit of resentment, a bit of an us and them dynamic. And you might dig your heels in, sidle up to your expat friends and kind of really decide that it's you against the world, which again is even more likely with native English speakers and even more likely to solidify your status as someone who cannot speak the local language. Obviously, this is a very extreme view and there are different levels of this possible scenario. It's much more likely to happen if you've learned none of the language or if you didn't invest in classes when you arrived, which is probably the most expensive but also the fastest way to catch up if you arrived with nothing. And it is only likely to play out also if you were a bit unlucky as well in some of these scenarios. I often wonder how my friend of a friend got on in Spain, but either way, at the end of the day, if a person is moving to a foreign country with no plans of learning the language, it's just probably not the reason that they've moved there in the first place. Maybe they're not inspired yet. It took me going on my exciting trip to South America and being exposed to the language and the culture and the people for me to then, when I moved back to Melbourne, learn the language. And of course, motivation and inspiration are key driving forces when it comes to learning a language. I hope you found this video interesting or useful in some way. If you're interested in watching more content on my channel, I'll be posting new stuff every week. If you haven't already, you could also watch my video on how I learned a language for the price of a beer and a few books. Thanks very much and see you next week.